Hi there. You know, sometimes I think we over-rely on the golden hours of sunrise and sunset to get beautiful landscape photos. And yesterday I was supposed to climb Ben Lomond to get a sunrise shot. But when I looked out at the sky, it was really cloudy and boring and absolutely thick cloud. So I knew there was no chance of that happening. So instead, I spent the day around Loch Lomond taking advantage of that sky. So let me take you back 24 hours and show you how I spent the day making the most of that cloudy, boring sky. Okay, so the first thing is to think about what actually is interesting. And behind me, those hills on the far side of the loch have got some low-hanging cloud hanging over them. So that's quite interesting. Quite a lot of the other surroundings don't have the cloud quite so low and they're not hanging down over the top of the hills. The other areas are also quite dark. So I'm going to take advantage of this whilst it's still there and get those hills with the low-hanging cloud. But I need something interesting in the foreground as well. And I found these little rocks just a little way out into the loch. It would be nice if they were a little bit bigger or even were a little bit nearer to me, but we'll take what we can. So I'm going to smooth out the water entirely, and I've got two filters on. I've got my 5-stop and 6-stop filter on together, and that is adding up to give me a 30-second exposure at f16, and that will entirely smooth the water out but still give me front to back focus. So let's take a crack at that. Self timer on just to remove any movement in the camera whatsoever so I get perfectly steady. It's started, 30 seconds time. Let's see what that looks like. Okay, so I'm a bit further around the loch now and I found this rusty old pier, and I quite like the juxtaposition of this ugly rusty old thing versus the beauty of the loch and the background mountains. So I'm going to take a photo of that, but I think there's a couple of compositions I'm going to try. I'll come to those in a moment. But firstly, one of the problems with this is that in terms of colour, the colour of that pier is roughly the same as the colour of the rocks that are in the cliffs on the background mountain near to it. And I've tried a few different positions, but I can't avoid having the pier near those rocks that are on the other side of the loch. So what I'm going to do with that is go black and white, because although in terms of colour they're quite similar, in terms of tonal contrast they're quite different. So the pier looks quite dark and the background rocks look quite bright. So that's going to really help me. And the first composition I'm going to try is pretty much what you can see here. I've got this tree at the side and I've got a nice little bit of reflection in it in the water. What I don't like about it though is that we get a bit of the shoreline, and I prefer not to have that in it, but there is no way to get that tree reflection without it. And then I'm going to try one much closer cropped in to the pier with just a little bit of the background mountains in the background. So let me make a start on those and I'll show you what I'm doing. So firstly, the wider shot. Now, I don't want to smooth the water out again, so I've got my 6 to 9 stop variable filter on. And what I've done is set up the composition with the tree on the right, the pier in the middle, and then the hills in the background. And because I want to go for something about 30 seconds, because that should smooth the water out nicely, I'm going for f16 to get as much in focus as possible. What I'm doing is just using the variable filter to control the exposure. And I want it to look quite overexposed because of that boring sky. So making the most of it and just embracing it, if you push the exposure and go for something a little more, I'm getting here between 1 1/3 and 1 2/3 stops overexposed. And just by changing the variable filter, I can change the exposure. So let me show you this. So there we can see what the camera thinks is roughly a proper exposure, but it's quite dark. And if I just push it and overexpose it by turning that filter, I can get to something like 1 2/3 of a stop overexposed, and it gives me a really nice airy feel. So next, I'm going for that closer in crop on the pier with just a little bit of the hills in the background. And I'm following the same procedure I did before, just turning the variable filter and using the filter to control the exposure. And honestly, I'm not sure which one I prefer. I think I'd prefer both of them if I was at a more elevated position and I could get the top of the pier below the waterline, so the waterline isn't cutting through the pier in the background, but there is no elevated position here to do that. But I quite like these shots and I'm not sure which one I prefer. So you take a look at them both, let me know which one you think's better in the comments. Okay, so one other way to avoid those clouds and getting too much cloud, overcast, boring cloud in your photos is to take the cloud out of the photos entirely. And as I was driving along the loch, I saw this old, well, I think it's an old jetty, but there's some rotting wood sticking out into the loch. And it's pointing over towards a building on the other side. I think it's a hotel. It looks really nice. There aren't many buildings on the edge of this loch, so it stands out. And I was really hoping that the jetty would point directly to the house and be a leading line towards it, but it isn't. It's just pointing off the edge of the house slightly. So I'm going to forget about the house or the hotel or whatever it is and just focus on the jetty. So I'm pointing down towards the jetty with the water beneath it. I've got two filters on this time. I've got my 6 to 9 stop filter. I've also got a CPL filter on, circular polarizing filter, and that will cut any glare off the water and hopefully bring through some of the rocks that are at the bottom of the loch, just underneath that structure, that jetty or whatever it is. But I'm also going to take a second shot from this kind of position just a little way further along there. So over here we've got Ben Lomond, which is the mountain that overlooks the loch that I should have been climbing today. And I think it'd make a really nice picture to have the loch with the jetty and Ben Lomond in the background. So firstly, let's get the water shot done. Now, the important thing with something like this is to make sure that all the legs of the jetty are lined up and symmetrical. There's equal spaces, equal gaps between the spaces. I often see shots like this online. They always look kind of nice, but it's always really distracting if you're a little way over to one side, you're not perfectly in the middle. So take the time, make sure you line up the shots. You've got equal gaps between each of the legs, and happy days. So I wanted to show you the raw file because some of you might be surprised by this golden colour. And what that is the CPL filter cutting off the reflection from the surface of the loch and allowing the sand at the bottom of it to come through. And here is my edited photo. And despite what I said about trying to make sure that everything was even, with this jetty, there are so many parts that are cracked, warped, bent. It just wasn't possible, but it's close enough, and its age is part of the charm of it. Okay, so the first tip is to look for the layers in the land. So I found this composition just behind me. You can see that the hills or the mountains come right down to the edge of the loch, and there's layers in them. So there's a lot of haze in the sky today, and as you go further back through those layers, each layer gets progressively lighter because there's a little bit of haze there. And normally I don't like haze in photographs, but in a situation like this, it really does help to separate out each mountain one after another. But I need to find a slightly better composition, because what we've got here, you can probably just tell that the tops of those trees just there are touching the mountain in the background. So I want a little bit of separation between the tops of those trees and the next mountain. So I'm probably going to have to walk a few hundred meters along the shoreline down here, scramble over some rocks, and I'll find a new composition and we'll pick up there. Okay, so I've found a position. I'm along these rocks. It's a little bit unsteady, so I've got to be careful. But what I've got here is a composition with all of those mountains converging towards the loch. And the first thing I want to think about is the extent to which I want the water smoothed out. So as you can probably see behind me, there's ripples going all across the water. I'm at about 115 millimeters, something like that. So if I wanted to freeze the action, I'd probably need to go for a shutter speed of something like 1/120th of a second. But often with these kind of water scenes, you want to smooth the water out, at least to a certain extent. And I like to think about how important the water is to the composition. So because I've not really got any foreground here, I want to see a little bit of texture in the water. I don't want all these ripples. I don't want it to be frozen, but I don't want it to look like a pane of glass either. So I'm not going to go for a sort of 20 or 30 second exposure, which would completely smooth the water out. I'm going to go for something maybe round about 2 or 3 seconds. And that should just give a little bit of texture to the water, enough to make the water look a little bit more interesting for saying it's going to be such a dominant part of the scene. So that's the first thing I've got to think about. And next, the exposure. Well, if I want to go for a slightly longer shutter speed, even though it's quite dark today, I am going to need to use a filter. So I've put my 6 to 9 stop variable ND filter on, and I am at about 9 stops, maybe just under it. So let's take a test shot and see what that looks like at, let's go for 2 seconds. Okay. So I'm focusing on the background hills. 2 second exposure going to start any time now. I've got a 10-second self timer on at the minute, just because these rocks are a little unsteady. And that's looking all right. But I think I want to smooth it out just a little bit more. So let me go for... And just as I start to take the next shot, a speedboat comes past, so give me a second. So, someone water skiing. Unfortunately, not only has the water skiing ruined the audio for that little bit, I'm also now going to have to wait for the water to settle down when they've gone out of shot. We'll be back in a second. He fell in. Not that I'm feeling any kind of schadenfreude from this, but does get a bit annoying when your shots get ruined. But it's not my loch all to have to myself, so I've got to put up with it. Now, he's doing circles pretty much right in front of me, right in the bit that I'm wanting to photograph. You know, this loch is something like 23 miles long, and they've got to go and do their water ski circles right in front of me. Okay, service is resumed. The water skiers have gone. So I'm going to go back. Same settings, the lighting hasn't changed. I'm at 3.2 seconds for this one. And that should just smooth the water out that tiny little bit more, but not so much that it's entirely smooth. So let's go for that shot. So I really like that. I like the layers. I've gone for a really dark exposure so that the nearest mountains converging on the loch are quite dark. They're almost black. but that's bringing out a lovely bit of texture in those clouds. And there's a tiny bit of texture left in the water. So for saying there's no foreground in this shot, there is still quite a lot of depth because of those layers. I'm quite happy with that one. So I hope you found that useful, and if you did, you might be interested to learn about how to make the most of unexpected weather conditions. And this time last year, I spent the day on Ben Macdui, and I got every type of weather you can imagine, apart from snow, all in one day. And you can check out a video on how I made the most of that here. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.